In the second part of this tutorial, we complete the final maps required to finish the sand rocks material. And so now that we've completed the height for our material, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our initial setup here. So we can get rid of this guy. I'm just going to start plugging in our nodes into their appropriate outputs. So we can plug our ambient occlusion down there, plug our height in down over there. And I'm going to plug in a few uniform color nodes into our outputs here just to do a quick visualization and fix anything that needs fixing once we view our outputs in our 3D. I'm going to plug that guy in there and do about a mid-gray, and I'm going to take this and plug it into the roughness as well. I'm going to take another one, plug this into our metallic, and again I'm going to make sure that's grayscale, and I'm going to quickly optimize this uniform color as well, coming back up to absolute and bringing that down to 16 by 16 pixels. So now that all my outputs have something plugged in, I'm going to right click in our graph, go to view outputs in 3D, and I'm just going to quickly take a look and see anything that needs changing. And right now I think our height map needs a little bit of decontrasting, so I'm going to bring this to maybe 0.4. And actually, you know what, I'll leave this at 0.5. I'm going to go back to our rocks in our blend over here. And I'm just going to decrease the size of our rocks to something like 0.35. Just so they're not popping out a little too far. And they look like they're sunken into the sand just a little bit. And so now that we've got everything plugged in, I'm going to go ahead and start on our albedo, or our base color here. So I'm going to bring this guy up. And I'm going to bring this guy just down over here. And the first thing I want to do is start by working from the ground up. So in this case, I'm going to start by working on our sand material. I'm going to come over and find where we've blended our sand just before, we blended our sand. And I'm going to add a gradient map. And I'm going to plug this guy in. I'm going to bring this all the way over here. So when I plug this guy in, our material is going to start to take on whatever we've got plugged into our output. So in order to start this, I want to go ahead and think of just very large and not overly complicated colors to block in to our material. So I'm going to click on our spectrum here. And I'm going to find a little bit of a lighter orangey yellow, kind of like a beige really, or cream. And then I'm going to find a little bit of a darker, maybe closer to orangey yellow. And this is just going to be a kind of a starting point for us to block in our colors one by one. So I'm good for that. But I want to add some more speckle and more fine granular detail, because we've got, you know, our sand, and each grain of sand is going to be a little bit of a different color. So I'm going to add a white noise fast node, just going to give us a bunch of different random color values. And I'm going to plug it through a gradient map as well. And so I'm going to blend these together. And I'm going to do the same for this gradient map, where I'm going to try and get a bunch of random different colors. Now, instead of trying to do this by hand and placing each handle down, what we can do, we can type in sand into our browser, and we can just Google images it. And we can find any one of these images that we like the color values for, and I like something like this. And what we're going to be able to do is click on pick gradient, and we're going to be able to just drag a line around, and it's going to select a gradient based off of the colors that we drew over. So I'm going to just remove all this. I'm going to hit pick gradient, and I'm just going to click and drag over top of those color values. And you can see that it's going to give us a bunch of different color values because it was so noisy of a texture. We also get this little blue speck in there, and I don't really like that. So I'm going to try and get rid of that. There we go. And with this, I'm going to just overlay the blending mode. And then decrease the opacity so that we still get some of the see-through of our initial texture here. That's looking pretty cool. I'm going to repeat the step that we just did, except this time with a fractal sum base, just to get more variety in our actual grains here. So what I'm going to do, I'm down to fractal sum base. And the reason that I'm using a fractal sum base is because we get a little bit larger granularity as opposed to our white fast, where it's very, very contrasted. And so this is going to give us a little bit of a different look, and we can go into our gradient editor here, and we can get rid of a large portion of it. And again, bring this into our blend. We can go down to overlay and just greatly reduce the opacity as well. And this is going to help us really get that nice granular kind of look. Lastly, I want to add just a little bit more unique specks of larger clumps of sand. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get a dirt 2 node here. I'm going to add another blend. This time we're going to use a uniform color and plug that guy in. And I'm going to use the dirt as our opacity mask. And you can see it's just going to basically splay itself over top of the entire texture here. And so with that, what we can do is change this black color to a more appropriate light yellow color. And something like that looks pretty cool. And so now that we've got our sand covered, I want to go ahead and start by creating some color for our rocks. I'm going to add another gradient map here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go find where we've got kind of our final drop off for our height here. And so I'm going to use this to really just color the rocks, and then we're going to mask off the rest of the sand and just overlay our rock texture on top of our sand here. So I'm going to add a blend, and I'm going to take this guy and pop him right into the top. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back all the way to where we've blended together our height, or our sand and our rocks. And I'm going to take that height mask on the bottom there. I'm going to use this to plug into our opacity. And we're going to be able to use this to just color our rocks however we like and not worry about it affecting the sand. I'm going to come back up to our gradient map. And I want these rocks to be a little bit more gray in value. Again, I might have a little bit darker. And go towards maybe the blue end of the spectrum here. It's very, very subtle. effect. Something like that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to add a little bit more surfacing information, and we're going to be able to draw that from our normal map. I'm going to come back to our normal map here, and I'm going to add a curvature smooth. I'm going to plug this guy in here, and you can see that we're going to get a lot of edge information that I'm going to be able to use to kind of provide a sense of what's going on with our height as well. So I'm going to bring this guy up over top here, and I'm going to add a blend node again to our chain, and I'm going to plug this in. And because we've got a color input here and a grayscale output, I'm going to need to make sure we put a gradient map on this guy. And now we're going to be able to see it show up. So I'm going to go to our blending mode here, and I want to do add and subtract. You can see it kind of gives us this little stylized looking material. So we really want to drag down the opacity. But the reason I use this here is it's going to give us a little bit of surfacing information at the top of our rocks here, kind of like some bleaching effect. And it's also going to help us push our recessed areas of our sand down a little bit further and give it a little bit more groundedness. And you can see it kind of taking effect here if we, again, play around with the opacity. So something like 0.1 should be fine. It's a very subtle effect. And actually, I might even decrease it a little bit more to something like 0.08. And again, it's just a very, very small effect. And now the next thing I want to do is add a little bit more edge wear to our rocks here so that they've got a little bit more wear and tear. So I'm going to bring this guy back so we've got a lot more room to work with. And I'm going to add another blend. So the way that we're going to go about retrieving our edge information from our rocks is we're going to again use our normal map, and it's going to pretty single-handedly provide us with all of that information. So I'm going to add a curvature map, and again we're going to draw from our normal map, and you can see again we're going to get, boom, instantly nice edge information that we're going to be able to use to highlight and mask our edges. So I'm going to add a uniform color node, and I'm going to plug this guy again into our blend. So the problem with our curvature mask right now is that it's pretty grayscale, and we really want to use it more as a binary mask. So for our curvature, I'm going to add a levels node. I'm going to really crank up the black and really crank up the white so that we're getting a very, very binary black and white mask. Maybe bring the white down a little bit, black up more. And this is going to give us some nice edge information. So when I plug this guy in, you can see that the black is going to show up right along the edges of our rock. However, we have another issue, is that we're going to get black showing up all over our entire texture. So again, the way that we can circumvent this is by using our rock mask in conjunction with the mask that we created for the edge wear. So I'm going to add a blend, and I'm going to go find where we've plugged in our rock mask over here for our gradient map. And I'm just going to control and left click to snag this guy, and I'm going to plug him in over top. And so what that's going to do is just give us the gradient or the mask, but we want to try and blend these two together. And the blending mode that we can use is multiply. So it's going to remove any of the lighter values of this texture here and keep any of the darker values thus eliminating any of the sand areas of this texture map, but keeping everything that fits inside of this white value here. And it's going to result in us just getting some nice edge wear on our rocks. And we can then go ahead and change this color. And I'm going to set the blending mode to overlay. And then bring the opacity down just slightly to about 0.5. That's going to give us just a little bit of edge information, some nice wear and tear. Again, trying to optimize our texture, I'm going to make sure that for our uniform color that we set this to absolute and 16 by 16 pixels. And I'm going to come back here and do the same for this guy too. The next thing I want to do is add a little bit more dust information onto the color of our rocks here. Because right now they're looking pretty clean and not overly affected by the sand that they're surrounded by. Especially too when you get, certain little cracks and crevices that clearly sand would get into and stick around. So I'm going to add another blend. I'm going to bring in a uniform color, and actually what I'm going to do is delete that guy and just control D this guy so that we already have a 16 by 16. I'm going to make this more of a dusty brown color. I'm going to add in a dirt filter. And so it's going to bring in this node here. And you can see that we've got a couple of different inputs that we can use. So we can input our ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and world normal. So you don't have to input all of these, and we're actually only going to input the top two here, the ambient occlusion and the curvature. So I'm going to connect this to our ambient occlusion here. And you can see what that's done is just added a little bit of a mask. And we're going to use our curvature as well. And so we've already got a curvature we've used for our rock edges. So I'm going to take this guy and plug that in as well. And you can see what this has done is essentially just made a mask for us. Now, there makes no real sense for us to use this mask for the sand because sand really isn't dusty. It's kind of what sand is. So we really want to mask off the sand and just leave it for the rocks like we did for the edge wear over here. So we're going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to blend this together. I'm going to steal this guy over here, which is our rock mask. And then I'm going to change the blending mode to multiply. So now we're just going to get our rocks masked off with the inside information going to be used for our dirt. And you'll see once I plug this guy in, we've got a lot of more grunge and dirt showing up on our rocks. Now I don't really like the color, so I'm going to just click that little guy down there. And I'm going to find an area of the sand that looks pretty close to the color that we want. And maybe just change the value just a little bit. And now we can go in with the dirt and we can change a bunch of different parameters that are going to better fit our rocks. Let's take a look here. Find a nice good rock to look at. And we can decrease the actual dirt level so that it's not as overbearing. We can increase or decrease the contrast. We can change the amount of grunge that we're going to get all over our texture there. And the amount of masking that our edges are going to receive. We can also change the grunge scale to make it a lot more smaller information, but this doesn't really matter for this. I'm going to bring the dirt level down just a little bit more because I still want some of that rock color to show through. Maybe get our grunge amount up just a little bit. There we go. And that's looking pretty cool. So to finish up on our color, I'm going to bring this guy over here. I'm going to add a blend. And what I'm going to do is I want a little bit more of shadow information just around our rocks and all that. So I'm going to go down to our ambient occlusion and I'm going to just bring this guy up into our blend. And again, adding a gradient map, we're going to be able to see what our ambient occlusion looks like on our material. And I'm going to go into our blending mode and I'm just going to hit multiply. And you can see what our shadow information is doing is just pretty much pushing down our recessed areas and leaving our taller areas much untouched, really. So I'm going to bring the opacity all the way down to 0.1. And it's going to be, again, a very subtle effect. It just helps us give a little bit nicer color, a more realistic color. You don't really want to overdo it with your ambient occlusion because, like you see, you get something that's pretty blown out and it doesn't really work in the lighting situations. I'm going to add a sharpen node on top of this, just again to get a little bit more crisp of color information. And now, right now, this is a little bit too intense, so I'm going to do 0.15. And again, we can see the difference is just a little bit blurry, and this is a little bit crisper. Again, it's a very, very subtle effect, but I like to put a sharpen on most all of my albedos, as it just makes things a little crisper. And the last node I'm going to add is an HSL, or a hue, saturation, and lightness node. And this is going to allow us to control the overall hue, saturation, and lightness of our material. So I like to bring this to around 0.45 just to desaturate a little bit, and that might be a little bit too much, so let's do 0.48. I just like to desaturate the material ever so slightly just to give it a little bit more authenticity. We normally oversaturate our color values when working on materials and greatly inflate the saturation of our textures more so than they really are in the real world. So I normally try and keep the saturation a little bit lower towards the end, just so I know that I'm trying to be as true to the real world as possible. So we've completed our base color, and I want to go ahead and start working on our normal and our roughness. So the only thing that we really want to do with our normal is I want to add a little bit of height information or normal information for these white specks that we added. And so we can find the dirt node that we created, and I'm just going to create a normal node and plug that guy in. You can see we're just going to get very small information that we can blend over top of our normal here. And so on our height normal here, I'm going to add a normal blend. And what this is going to allow us to do is keep our normal background while adding some extra detail normal in our foreground. And we're going to be able to mask it off, because right now, if we were to leave it on, we would actually have some of the normal information cutting through our rocks. And that's not going to look correct because it's really only on the sand that we have these specks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find where we've got our, again, rock mask, and I'm just going to snag that from there and plug this guy in. And you can see what that does is completely the opposite of what we wanted, because we've got the white value telling us again to use the top node here. So all we need to do is add an invert grayscale. And I'm just going to leave that guy there. So now you can see that we've got all of this little white specks having some normal information on the sand. And so now I'm going to reduce the opacity to about 0.05, maybe a little bit higher. Let's try 0.1. Just so that we get a little bit of information, but for the most part, it's just going to be the sand. I might bring that up even a little bit higher to maybe 0.2. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, and that looks a lot better. So we get a little bit of our white speckle information, but for the most part, it is just our sand here. So now that we've got our normal map all figured out, I'm going to go ahead and start work on our roughness map. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of that color right there, because we're not going to use it, and I'm actually going to use our normal map once again to create the basis for how our roughness is going to look. So it's a good thing that we finished our normal map first, because I'm going to use a curvature smooth node, take our finished normal blend here, and I'm going to plug this guy in. And so this is going to be the basis of our roughness. Except the only issue that I have with this, and if you've watched any of my previous tutorials, you've probably heard this 1,000 times, is that the darker values for a roughness map are the glossy areas or the shinier areas, and the white values are the rougher areas. So for our material here, that doesn't quite make sense, where the more recessed areas are glossier and the areas up top here are much shinier. So I'm going to add a levels node onto this guy. I'm going to invert our values here. Again, bumping up our white value because realistically not a lot of this is going to be glossy. I'm also going to bring in our black output and our white outputs so that nothing ever reaches a full black or a full white. And I'm also going to keep things at a relatively mid-gray. And the rocks can be a little bit glossier because they might be a little bit wet or a little bit shiny from some nice wear and tear, especially because we've got somewhat smooth rocks, so they can be a little bit shinier. But for the sand, we want to try and keep it at about a mid-gray. I'm going to add a blend node. And I'm going to, again, find our dirt specks here. And I'm going to take that and plug this guy in as well. And I'm going to go down to subtract, and it's going to take any of the lighter dirt values that we have and basically remove them from our light values on our levels here. And so what this is going to do again is have a little bit more of glossier areas where they're just going to be a little bit shinier than the rest. And so I'm going to again decrease that opacity just to add some more breakup to our roughness map. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use our dirt mask that we have for our rocks and make that its own layer on our roughness map so that we're not getting the dirt to be a little bit glossier like the rest of the rock. So I'm going to add a blend. I'm going to again take our cobbled together mask for our dirt or our dust, and I'm going to bring that down and plug that guy in. And now for this one, because we want the areas of the dirt to be white, I'm going to take this and I'm going to screen. And what screen does is it's going to remove any of the darker values and just keep the lighter values. So that's a little bit too contrasted. So I'm going to bring the opacity down to about 0.3. So if we take a look here, we'll be able to see that we still get some glisten on our rocks. If I bring this value down, we're going to get some glisten on our rocks, but once it gets to the dirt, it's not going to be as shiny. So I'm going to bring this back up. And now I've realized that I maybe want to have a different and separate control for the opacity or the roughness of these rocks. So before this guy here where we added the dust, I'm going to add a blend. And I'm going to go over to, again, our height mask for our blend here. And I'm just going to snag our rocks one more time. And I'm going to use this as the opacity map for our rocks here. So now we've got our rocks completely sectioned off. And I can just change the grayscale value of this uniformly. And we can see here, if I do this, I can make the rocks completely glossy or completely rough. And if we look further down, because we placed this before the mask, it's going to honor the dust map that we have overlaid over top. So regardless of what we make the roughness of the rocks, it's still going to have the same roughness for the dirt. And so I think 75 might be okay. We get a little bit glossier rocks, but still keep some nice dirt. So now that we've completed our material, I'm ready to expose our rock amount parameter. And so I've come back over here to where we've created our histogram scan. And again, as we increase the position, we can decrease the amount of rocks that we've got, and vice versa. And our material adapts to the rocks that we've added or subtracted from our material here. So all we need to do is we come down to our histogram scan. We can come into our properties here. And I'm just going to click on this guy for our position, and I'm going to expose. And so it's going to pop up with this little expose parameter tab. And so we can select the name of the new input. So this is the name for Substance Designer to understand what actual parameter we're trying to expose. So often cases, what I'll do is I'll come in and actually give this a new name, but because this is the only parameter that we are exposing, position is unique enough that we don't actually need to change it. So I'm going to hit OK. And you can see now in my histogram scan, I can't actually change it here. That's because we've exposed it, so it's no longer unique to this node, but actually it's been opened up to our entire graph. So I can double click anywhere on the graph, and as I come down here, you can see that in our input parameters, we've got position, float 1. And so float is the type of editor that we've got, and you can see that it's going to be a slider. Now, if I come down to label, label is going to be what the actual name of the slider is going to be if I want to name it something unique. Otherwise, it's going to default back to position. So I want to call this rocks amount. And so you can see now it's changed to rocks amount. And so we get a couple different sliders down here. And so default is whatever value it's going to be set at by default. So you can see that right now it's 0 is what we left it at. And if I crank it up, it will actually change and update on our material here. So I'm going to leave our default at 0.5. Our min value is the minimum amount that our default can go in either direction. And so because I want to be able to show all the rocks, I'm going to leave our minimum at 0. And because I want to be able to also remove all our rocks, I'm going to leave our max at 1. We can also check and see how this is going to look in a preview if we come up to this eyeball here. And we can switch to preview mode, and you can see now our parameter is called rocks amount. And as I play around with it, our rocks show up and remove entirely.